now I want to put oh, every time I click on slideshow, it fills my whole screen. I don't want to keep everybody. Hello, everybody, and apologies for this. I've got a slideshow which I quite like to show because there's one or two pictures on it, and I'm just having trouble getting it onto the screen. Oh, here comes my husband.
We have tech support.
You've clicked on the slideshow.
Well, when I click on slideshow, it fills the whole screen, and so I can't do anything.
There we go. You've begun sharing your screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Have you got the slideshow?
So we just need to fill it. So if we go over to slideshow there, just up the top. Yes.
Yes.
And from beginning. Fantastic.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're good to go. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So as you can see now, I would like to talk about the impact that Viktor Frankl's work has had on me, and during my life, particularly my academic life, because I hadn't heard of Viktor Frankl until I was an academic psychologist. Here is Viktor Frankl. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with these pictures, but I just wanted to make sure, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with the details of his life. I put this brief biography up because it gives us aspects of his life history which I think are relevant to our current topic. He was born into a nice family, although there were some difficult experiences during World War I. Everybody thought it was rightly correct. Everybody thought correctly that it was a terrible, terrible time. And Frankl himself, his family were starving, and he was obliged to, with his brother and sister, run around begging, particularly from local farmers, for scraps of food. As a high school student, he was obviously extremely brilliant. He attended psychology lectures. He exchanged letters with Freud, and published an article in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, which I believe is still probably the top, or certainly one of the top journals in the field. And at the age of 15, gave a public lecture on the meaning of life. And he also played a very active and prominent role in socialism, and was attracted to the Adlerian movement. That bit didn't last for too long, but he studied medicine, and continued his interest in social reform, and continued to publish his work, his writings, and he introduced the term logotherapy, which we're all familiar with, and on much less cerebral side, he developed a strong interest in mountain climbing, which persisted, and after World War II, he developed an interest in flying as well. And he organized youth counseling services in Vienna. That was very innovative. And apparently the youth suicide rate dropped probably as a consequence, and this attracted a lot of international interest. And then, unfortunately, there was a German invasion of Austria. The whole country began to be Nazified, and the lives of the Jewish population were in significant danger. There were other people whose lives were in danger, particularly psychiatric patients, and Frankl heroically...
Sorry, I'm going to make it quiet.
Sorry? Frankl heroically gave false diagnoses and treatments that improved the patient's condition so that they didn't appear insane anymore, and managed to get the patients classified as medical rather than psychiatric patients, thereby saving their lives, although it was a major risk to his life. In this period, he was offered a visa to the United States, which he declined because he couldn't get a visa for his parents. His parents couldn't get visas, and he decided to stay with his parents in Austria. He married, and then he and his parents and his wife were all arrested and deported first to Theresienstadt, where his father passed away, and then the remaining three went to Auschwitz, where his mother and his wife were also died. So he was the sole survivor of that family group. His brother and sister had managed to escape. He set to work organizing with other psychiatrists and psychologists some psychological support for newly arrived inmates. They saw what a terrible shock, as indeed anybody would be terribly shocked, it was to actually arrive in the camp, and many people simply committed suicide when they realized what they'd come to. So many people survived as a result of the support provided by Frankl and his colleagues. He did survive, and despite the despair he felt after liberation, he continued to develop his life. He married again, and he continued with his professional work, with his writing, with his lecturing, and his books became enormously popular. I believe he published over 30 books, which in itself is an incredible achievement. And of course, he did a great deal of traveling in the dissemination of his work, and he continued to practice as a psychiatrist. And after he passed away in the late 1990s, existential therapy, as you know, and logotherapy continue to develop and continue to be popular, although, as we'll see, not as popular as some of us would like. Let me turn now and give you a brief introduction to myself. I've lived in the UK all my life, and I'm married to Naftali Loewenthal, who is an academic expert on Jewish history and Jewish mysticism and Hasidism. We have a very large family, and we are affiliated to Chabad. I have an academic career in psychology, and my teaching interests included psychodynamic theory and practice, and my research interests were in social and clinical psychology. I was particularly interested in the relations between religion and mental health, and did quite a lot of work on mental health in minority groups, particularly the Jewish community. And since retiring some years ago, I did some recent training and developed a small practice in trauma therapy using a technique known as EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is, in spite of its slightly bizarre, well, very bizarre methods, bizarre seeming methods, and its rather odd title, is extremely effective. There's a lot of evidence, and it's recommended both by the British National Health Service and in most or all other Western countries as probably the quickest and most effective method for relieving people of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as you almost certainly know, is a condition which was only developed in around 1980. It was only identified in 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association. And it's a condition which millions of people have suffered from for many years, but has only in the last 40 years been been identified, and the treatments are now being developed, and EMDR is probably the most effective. I'm burbling on about this form of trauma therapy because I want to talk about Frankl's work on and ideas on trauma and spirituality, and try and relate some of my work to those ideas. I first heard of Frankl about 50 years ago. A young social worker was staying with us for Shabbat, and he had visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe, leading Hasidic Rebbe in New York, and somewhat surprisingly, the Rebbe had recommended to his attention the work of Frankl. So as a result of that, I also looked at the work of Frankl and began to read Frankl's work and tried, as you'll see, to develop my interest and connections. I introduced Frankl to the psychology students, and tried to incorporate him generally into my teaching of psychodynamic theory and psychodynamic practice. I like stories, and my favorite story from Frankl is, I think, the rolling in the dirt story. He introduced a technique which has more recently been incorporated into cognitive behavior therapy, but I believe that the idea was originally Frankl's. He suggested that if people were obsessed with a particular compulsion or fear, they should carry out what he labeled paradoxical intentionality. For instance, a client of Frankl's who was terrified of getting dirty was continually washing themselves and showering themselves. Frankl said, I would like you now to go and roll in the dirt and get yourself as dirty as you possibly can. And the patient at first was shaken and horrified by this suggestion. And then when Frankl made this kind of suggestion to his patients, their reaction was almost always the same. At first, they were, for a second or so, totally, utterly horrified that he could suggest such a thing. And then they would begin smiling and laughing, realizing that if they confronted what they were most afraid of, it had lost its power to terrify them and to preoccupy them. I made efforts to locate others with academic and clinical interests in Frankl. I knew that in British psychotherapy, the two big movements were psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapy and theory, and cognitive behavior therapy. And I wasn't aware that there was any significant practice of Frankl's ideas of existential therapy, of logotherapy. So in the end, I wrote a letter to the monthly journal of the British Psychological Society, which is now called The Psychologist. And I think everybody who's a member of the British Psychological Society gets this. It's included in the membership fee, and I think pretty well everybody has a glance at it. And I got one response of the thousands of members of the British Psychological Society. I got one response from somebody who is perhaps known by name to some of you, Windy Dryden. I knew him already because his office at one point had been right next to mine in what was then Bedford College in London University. But meanwhile, Windy had moved on to another university, and he had introduced existential therapy and logotherapy ideas and techniques into his practice. He was practicing and teaching psychotherapy. But he was the only person who replied to that advertisement, and he said that he didn't think that logotherapy was being terribly widely practiced in Britain. Nevertheless, I felt and still feel that the existential approach is very important. And since retiring, I've developed a small clinical practice. It's small simply because I'm still very busy with pretty busy with academic commitments. But I find that quite a large number of the people I treat, although I'm explicitly saying that I want to focus on people with PTSD symptoms, a number of them are still claiming rightly that their underlying or main preoccupation is with existential issues. They'd like to have a reason for living. They'd like to have a purpose. They'd like to have meaning in their lives. So now let's turn to our host, Dr. Shimon Cowen. Here he is with a very few of his very many books, including on our left, the cover of the book whose launch we're celebrating today, which is particularly an anthology of previously unpublished writings by Viktor Frankl. But you can see even from this very tiny selection that Dr. Cowen has published, Shimon has published on a huge range of topics. And we see here him writing on marriage and human and personal relationships, as well as writing on Frankl on aesthetics and politics and ethics. I first met Shimon some years ago, and I was delighted when our dear son married our dear daughter-in-law from Melbourne, and that was over 20 years ago. And in the course of that, got to know Shimon and his wife better. And there's the connection there has been, I think, not just maintained, it's been developed, and there's been quite a lot of traveling backwards and forwards between Australia and the UK, including an important event in Oxford, which featured Dr. Cowen. And he, as you know, has done very much valuable work, improving awareness and knowledge of Frankl's work by translating, publishing, writing and speaking about Frankl. And this is all alongside his own work and output in philosophy and psychology. The huge variety and range of publications and activities. And I'm particularly interested because of the way that he's helped to make us more aware of the complexity and variability of religious and spiritual feelings and ideas and their relationship with mental health. He's done an enormous amount of speaking and writing, both on his own ideas and in his expositions and discussions of Frankl. And I've been privileged to take part in some of those events when I've been in Australia, in Melbourne. And the latest book, as you know, which is being launched today, it contains previously untranslated work by Frankl, and it's got some very powerful examples from Frankl's horrific concentration camp experiences. And it describes some of Frankl's work in helping people to develop meaning and purpose in life in spite of adversity. And Shimon Cowen has helped to develop the ideas of the importance of religious and spiritual issues in psychotherapy and psychiatric work. It's been controversy for years. I'm somewhat familiar with the controversy in Britain, where many psychiatrists have struggled to establish the so-called special interest group in spirituality in the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And I'm also painfully aware that the British Psychological Society has failed to do such a similar thing. In fact, won't do it. And I made, I would say, many attempts in the past. They declined to have sessions on religion and mental health in their conferences, and they declined to establish a section on the psychology of religion. They said that if they had a section on consciousness, states of consciousness, and that covered religion, but of course it didn't actually involve any significant, serious focus on work, religion, and mental health, or the psychology of religion, and they've got to, after the events of 2001. I was told by a colleague that who was very involved with the British Psychological Society, that she thought the British Psychological Society would start taking the psychology of religion a bit more seriously. And she was right, that we did manage to get a conference going, and we did manage to get a session included in BPS conferences, but it was rather belated and still lacking in volume and enthusiasm, certainly very, very pale and shadowy compared to what the psychiatrists were up to. In the book which is being launched today, I see that it is possible that, and the reviewers have said this too, that there's some evidence that Frankl, in his later work, was trying to detach his clinical work from spiritual and religious issues. But I think that there's also, if you look at the book, this detachment is far from complete. In fact, it seems to me that in the book there's a persistent preoccupation with the interplay between clinical issues and spiritual and religious issues in Frankl's writing. I'd like to briefly mention my personal experiences in trauma therapy before going back to Frankl. The top two pictures are examples of the sorts of situations that might be traumatizing for many people, in fact, probably for everybody. And the lower picture is an illustration of somebody practicing EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. The term EMDR, involving the term eye movements, is a bit misleading, because one can do the things that have the effects of eye movements without actually involving eye movements, as long as one alternately stimulates both halves of the brain. One will get the desensitization. It's a neurological effect, and it's quite powerful, and usually is pretty effective. So you don't have to do this waving of fingers in front of the person's eyes, although you can tap knees, your knees alternately, or you can tap shoulders like this. And this, the so-called butterfly, has become very popular during lockdown in treating patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, when I trained in this therapy, spiritual and religious issues weren't mentioned at all, not one word. And I began to practice EMDR techniques, which were initiated in 1989 by Francine Shapiro, without a spiritual or religious thought in my head. And after I'd been practicing for a few months, one of my clients said, you know, it's wonderful the way my my faith has got so much stronger since I had this therapy. I said, oh, that's interesting. We had to talk about it. She was a religious Jewish woman. And at the time, I was focusing on the Orthodox Jewish community because they had no ready access to EMDR. And it turned out that there was a big demand for this form of therapy. And I began asking my other clients whether they were having these sorts of experiences. And they all said, yes, 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 my faith has got much stronger. They distinguished between the betochen and emunah, two terms which represent religious faith and trust in Hebrew. And they said that their intellectual knowledge was not affected by EMDR. The belief that God is always there and is creating everything and doing everything the whole time. This they knew anyway, but they couldn't feel the sort of trust and security that they were developing to a stronger extent since they had had therapeutic help with their PTSD symptoms. So I began to investigate these effects more closely. I'm still very far from getting all the data and information I would like. Here are two little bar graphs which show the sort of one of the effects that I've identified. In order to have religious faith strengthened, you've got to have some kind of knowledge, background knowledge or experience. It doesn't seem to matter how flimsy it is. I've asked patients, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and some of the non-Jews have had very fragmentary early religious experience. As long as there's been something there, their religious feelings and faith are strengthened following successful trauma therapy. But if there's no religious background whatsoever, and this is very common or relatively common in Britain, especially, no, delete that last word. This is pretty common in Britain. People who had no religious upbringing at all did not get a strengthening faith because there was no faith to strengthen. They had no idea what was meant by the term religious faith, and nothing changed for them in terms of religion and spirituality because there wasn't any there to start off with. So I found that almost all those with some religious background or spirituality reported an improvement in religious faith following EMDR trauma therapy. And I wondered why and how these changes occurred and whether they're part of a wider ranging post-traumatic growth. And in Cowen's collection, Frankl writes, interestingly, that he believes that the concentration camp experience did not have a devastating effect universally on religious faith. He says he believes it's not true that most camp inmates lost their faith. And he experienced an enormous amount of spirituality and godliness in his work in the horrific conditions of the camps. And so I'd like to finish this talk with 3 very powerful quotes from the book that we are launching today. The first statement is that he has no statistics. I have no statistics, writes Frankl, but my own impression is that in Auschwitz, more people recovered their belief than lost it. Another statement, anyone who's ever stood in a concentration camp in a ditch with a pick and shovel and prayed there has spoken to God. In other words, he has a direct relationship with God in the most horrific conditions that we could imagine. And finally, I'll quote a very moving, part of a very moving story that he tells of a lady with bipolar disorder, who'd been horribly abused in the camp. Just before her death, in the filthy straw, she recited the Shema Yisrael in the midst of a deep psychotic illness. That, says Frankl, is what I mean by God slipping in to the most wretched person. So those are my concluding comments. As you can see, I'm extremely interested in what Frankl has to say about trauma and religious faith. And I believe that these three comments help to give us an idea of the range and depth of his experience and ideas on this topic. Thank you very much to Rabbi Shimon Cowen, for developing this wonderful new collection. It gives us an experience of Frankl's writings that helps to broaden and deepen our own feelings. Thank you. Oh, now I need to get rid of this board, don't I? Well, yeah.
There we go, we're back.
Thank you very much for arranging that so painlessly.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for what you've shared today. I found that personally very fascinating. What really jumped out for me there was the extent to which you were working, that the premise is working from a somatic and psychological position, really, with these trauma states. And naturally, we're seeing a spiritual and religious requirement emerging in your clients. And I would be fascinated to see what your future data produces around this area.
Yes. Thank you. That's a lovely statement of interest, and it doesn't really require a response. But I would just say that at the moment, I'm in this form of therapy. Clients are invited to report on the ideas and images that come into their minds while they're undergoing this bilateral stimulation. And I'm interested in the religious and spiritual ideas and feelings that they report. There's not very many, only a very small proportion of their reports involve religious and spiritual elements, but nevertheless, some of them do. And that's what I'm trying to analyze at the moment.
Watch this space.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to move on to Dr. George Halasz. Dr. George Halasz is an adjunct senior lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine, Melbourne University, and is a member of the editorial board of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. Since 2005, he's been the editorial board of Australasian Psychiatry. He has written and co-edited 3 books, many chapters and journal articles that deal with ADHD, trauma transmission, child psychotherapy and ethics, and spirituality and religion. I'd now like to share the screen and open up the floor to Dr. George Halasz. We'll just be certain that I haven't muted.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I demuted myself. Is that
fantastic?
All
good
right.
Initiative. You're good to go.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cowen for the honor and the pleasure to speak and share some thoughts here on this occasion. If I may be impersonal or informal, thank you, Kate, for a very beautiful introduction, not only to Frankl, but to yourself and your relationship. And I found that personal touch very, very moving. Also, I have greetings from my mother, Alice Halasz, to Shimon, and she wishes you mazel tov on the launch of your book. And so she hopes that you recall her from her attending your seminars many years ago. And I said, I will definitely pass on your very good wishes and mazel tov. I'll take a slight lead from Kate, and I didn't plan to introduce myself, but since the context is very appropriate, and Kate mentioned about the relationship to trauma and Frankl and her own professional life. Perhaps I should just mention that I actually come from a tradition as a child and adolescent and mother-infant psychiatrist. And so one of the central features of relationships between mothers and babies is one of relational trauma. And this is certainly not blaming or finger pointing, it's just how life is. And so in my mid-career, I became very interested after having had a more formal psychoanalytic dynamic training at the Tavistock Clinic and the Maudsley Hospitals. And I joined the British Association of Child Psychotherapists in their inaugural course in 1981 or 82. It's going back 40 years. I was trained in the traditional views of child development, which was very theory informed. There were lots of theoretical babies back then. There was a Freudian baby, there was a Winnicottian baby, there's a bionic baby, and so on. And then from the other side of the Atlantic, there were other babies from Mahler and others on the other side of the Atlantic. By mid-career, I was a little bit puzzled of what sort of a baby I was, because I got very confused with all the theoretical babies. And so it just happened that my mum in 1998 gave her Holocaust testimony to the Steven Spielberg Foundation, the Visual History Foundation, where survivors were interviewed. And she's one of over 50,000 people around the world who gave her Holocaust testimony. And within a couple of years, I followed the work of Shoshana Feldman and Dory Laub on witnessing and testimony, an influential couple in the 1990s. And I wondered what it was like for me to be the next of kin of a Holocaust survivor mother, and whether or not some trauma might have seeped across from her to me. Now, I didn't really wish to follow my training because I got confused in my training. There were so many babies theoretically, and I thought of myself more as a practical baby. I wasn't actually a Freudian baby or a Kleinian baby or a Winnicottian baby. I was Alice's baby. And I wanted to know how Alice Halasz and George Halasz influenced each other, and whether I could capture anything about what might correspond to trauma experiences. And of course, at that stage, videos were still the old format, not digital. And so what I did, which is a fairly standard way of researching trauma in children and mothers, is developed a split screen where I was watching my mother's testimony, and I had a professional video person video my facial reactions, and then we synchronized the screen. So the top left was my mother's testimony, synchronized in real time with my facial reactions. And I thought I'd have amazing facial reactions like, oh gosh, whatnot, hearing some of those unbelievable stories. What I found to my surprise is for great segments of her testimony, I was virtually stone-faced. My mother, bless her, had vitality. She would cry at appropriate places, laugh at appropriate places, and I was like a blank statue. And I coined the term that I felt I was in exile while I was witnessing her, that I didn't have any vitality left. Of course, at that stage in the early 2000s, there was no such word, no such concept as relational trauma. That was something that was introduced by Dr. Alan Shaw in 2001, where relational trauma, as described in his original works, was the trauma, not the conventional trauma of abuse or hurting, but a mismatch between a mother's attentiveness and mindfulness and the baby's dependency and the needs. And this was a radical, paradigm-changing insight. And clearly the last 20 years with trauma-informed therapy has developed this into, as Kate mentioned, EMDR preceded this, but the neurological basis for EMDR and so on. So how does all this relate to religion? Well, I have to say, and I did say this to Shimon as a precondition to agreeing to be here, that I have not followed Frankl for the simple reason that babies don't have logo. They are pre-verbal, they are non-verbal. And the mother-infant interaction is not a logical interaction, it's an instinctive, intuitive interaction. Later, of course, on these foundations, as Winnicott says, the baby becomes embodied, and there are many distortions of that embodiment and identity and self later, but the essence is not verbal, and therefore I said, and I repeat here, not as an excuse, but as an explanation of why my mainstream practice has never been affected by Frankl. And indeed, many of the other people whose work I have worked on have become either superseded or I've had to let them go lest I perpetuate their errors, which is a very painful thing in professional life, to have one's teacher's teachings outdated and indeed not just superseded, but sometimes proven wrong. So I've based my work on trauma on a single case study, in depth, with a 72-year follow-up. I'm just over 72 myself. My mum, bless her, is 95, and this is work in progress. And so it's all got the strengths and limitations of a single case study, but as far as I know, it's unique in having a 72-year follow-up. And I don't hold that what I know and believe today about intergenerational trauma and its transmission and its repair is right, and certainly not the final word. It's a work in progress. And so it's in this context that I read Shimon's amazing book last year. And to put it colloquially, he freaked me out. And I'll explain, and I'll read my book review that I wrote back then, because now a year later, I'm reading it and I'm still freaked out by the challenge that Shimon poses when his work comes to confront one's own consciousness. So Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cowen's invitation to review his book at once triggered in me both delight and dread. I've always come away delighted from our many conversations, learned from his erudite talks and writings, and felt honored to be invited to contribute to his first volume of the Journal of Judaism and Civilization in 1998, nearly 25 years ago. But I also had a sense of great dread, as I know that Shimon's ideas demand really close attention. It demands intense concentration and sustained focus just to keep up with his rapidly processing mind. To engage with Rabbi Cohen's deep, layered understanding, I find is an experience in self-discipline, to be sure always worth the effort. But this is why I was both dreading and delighted. So this foreknowledge, coupled with the title of his book, The Rediscovery of the Human, suggested a most challenging journey to retrace profound, complex inner journeys from the discovery to the rediscovery of the human. So I was taken back to the most basic big questions in life. Who am I as a person and as a therapist? I wondered if I should have accepted the invitation as soon as I read Rabbi Cohen's first page from Frankl's remarkable final sentence in the 10 theses concerning the person, one of the 5 translated chapters in the second part. That sentence that threw me off my track was, the true discovery of the human, the inventio hominis, occurs in the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. Now, just to contemplate that sentence blew my mind. Now you can begin to understand why I dreaded more than delighted from then on as I read on. At the heart of Shimon's book is his scholarly thoroughness, in which he offered 5 introductory chapters that illuminates Frankl's complex inner journey with some spiritual clarification. This is a double journey on many levels. As the inventor of logotherapy, Frankl initially rejected, only to subsequently reclaim Freud's psychoanalysis. That's enough of a journey in itself. And I'll come back to that, but I just wish to, as Kate mentioned, the relationship to many other therapies. In passing in Shimon's book, it should be noted that he focuses on Frankl and Freud's original therapies as the substance of that book. However, there are offered contrasts with other less well-known Jewish psychotherapists, and we should keep those in mind as well. To illustrate one example, Rabbi Cowen quotes Rabbi Amsel, and on page 65 he said, "There is no difference," this is Rabbi Amsel, "there is no difference in kind between the dynamics of normal and abnormal behavior, the difference being of degree only. Judaism views mental illness as a moral rather than a medical problem. It is only where the communication with the patient is impossible that Judaism would assign the cure to the medical profession." That throws me into one camp. I'm a medical practitioner. I'm also Jewish. Where do I stand on mental illness? Second example, Rabbi Chaim Lipschitz offered, "I tend towards careful use of psychological technique and not the philosophy of them behind them." Also page 65. Off track 2, where am I in all this? I do follow some of the psychological techniques and the philosophy, and I'm Jewish. Third one, Moshe Halevi Spiro offered the unified halachic view, which according to Shimon, quote, "seeks to determine the foundations in religious law itself for specific clinical treatments." I confess not knowing enough about Jewish law. Where does that leave me? Am I a competent therapist then? Am I a competent Jew? Back to the main thing. Rabbi Cowen explains in chapter 1 that his idea to write on Frankl arose from Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rabbi Kate mentioned, a letter wondering why Frankl's teaching failed to gain wider acceptance in therapeutic practice. Rabbi Cowen's study addresses and elaborates the Rebbe's partial response, which is worth listening to, that it had to do with a lack of therapists displaying a living example required for the practice of logotherapy. At least that put me off the hook. I was clearly not a living example, but that was only partial example, the excuse. The other was I was a child therapist who didn't use logotherapy anyway, because babies don't have logo yet. So I felt at least I could still continue in my profession. Rabbi Cowen's analysis seems to me to be a search for that spiritual spark, the divine, in logotherapy. His text follows intimate details in other texts, quoting from his own earlier publications, ever searching for clues, deeper and deeper connections between Frankl's philosophical, religious, and psychological ideas as they correspond with ideals within Jewish theological and mystical frameworks. In this intense quest, Rabbi Cowen's itinerary takes on Frankl's structure of personality, as he distinguishes bodily, the somatic, the mental, and the noetic, the meaning-making faculties or meaning-supplying faculties. In addition, Rabbi Cowen's spiritual illumination, in turn, is sparked by the Maharal of Prague's physical, gufnis, vital, hinui, and intellectual soul dimensions. Now, there are a number of very powerful tables that Shimon integrates in his book, and one table would be worth a seminar series, I would say. However, let me go to, as a clinician, what moved me most profoundly. And for me, the most dramatic section of the book was a case study. It involved the famous encounter between Freud and the Grand Rebbe, page 57. I'll quote parts. In the winter of 1902-3, the meeting in Vienna between Freud and Rabbi Sholom Dov Ber Schneerson, the Grand Rebbe, was documented by his son, Rabbi Joseph Yitzhak Schneerson. In response to Freud's curiosity, wanting to know what kind of scholarly discipline Hasidus was, the answer, my father's replied, the discipline of Hasidus requires that the head explain to the heart what the person should want, and the heart implement in the person's life that which the head understands. The conversation continued. And another account has Freud's explanation for the Rebbe's apparent suffering from low spirits as, quote, the professor, this is Freud, stated that the Rebbe's suffering was a deep inward one, which is found only in profound, committed thinkers. The heart desires more than the head can grasp, and the head understands more than the heart can come to. A sentence. I have found these few words offer so many interpretations to meditate on, over so many occasions, over so many years. Each time I read it, I find yet another level of meaning. For those who favor the long, short way, many of Shimon's book pages offer insights to treasure, to read, to reread, and to reread again once more, to finally savor what the meaning is. I'm a slow thinker, obviously. For those wishing the short, long way, Rabbi Shimon Cowen offers a final, ambitious, and integrative figure as 3-column summary on page 76. I'll just list the headings. First, the teachings of religious tradition, column 1. Column 2, the primary perspective on faculties of personality. 3, the relationship to the Noahide laws. Now, if you can't even find the links, welcome. I'm still struggling, yet Shimon's already integrated them. And so between the lines and between the spaces is a measure of what thinking and the depth and the profundity has gone into this book. So coming to the end, from the opening to the final chapter, Rabbi Cowen's profile of Frankl's complex life as philosopher and controversial therapist, whose unique therapy, logotherapy, arose partly as protest against the reductionist views from which he initially detached himself, Freud's psychoanalysis and Adler's individual psychology, which were the 2 dominant Viennese schools of thought at that time in the 20s and 30s. In contrast, Frankl imbued his approach with spirituality, the essence of man's quest for meaning. Rabbi Cowen highlights in forensic detail the ontological distinctions, still ongoing tensions and divisions between the teachings and traditions within the major streams of psychotherapies in 2021, as relevant as back then, and between them, all these schools and theology. Frankl expressed variously a search for meaning, a will to meaning, or a belief in meaning. I think those three faculties in themselves demand teasing out: a search, a will, and a belief. These are powerful human motivations in the image of God. Millions of readers shared his search for meaning, but as often stated, and Kate mentioned also, his logotherapy never entered mainstream schools. Yet, as Rabbi Cowen's last chapter concludes with the science of the soul, almost an oxymoron in many psychological schools today, we have much wisdom to encounter as we contemplate our worldview, to ask ourselves and to attune ourselves to transcendent experiences, both in our patient and in ourselves. My own response, I would respond to the science of the soul with a slight alteration on Frankl's words. His words were, God or my innermost self, to which I would ask, God as my innermost self. I thank Shimon, thank you so much for challenging all of us, for both the delight and the dread that you have caused me. My PTSD now a year after the original trauma back last year, it's worthwhile working through complex PTSD to arrive at some resolution. Thank you very much, Shimon.
Well, Douglas, are you going to?
I am here. I am back.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you for that, George Halasz. I am very glad to hear that you've got some post-traumatic growth there from your experience.
I am too, believe me.
But a resounding appreciation of the work of Shimon Cowen, Rabbi Shimon Cowen. A fantastic way, I think, to work into the information that he's researched and what he has to offer today and what he has to share today. So without further ado, I introduce Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cowen. Rabbi Shimon Cowen has a dual background in secular academia with a doctorate in social philosophy and qualifications in rabbinic studies. In 1998, he founded the Institute for Judaism and Civilization with the purpose of establishing an interface or communication between religious studies and the world of the secular arts and sciences. One of these areas of interface has been psychology, with a particular reference to the work of Viktor Frankl, whose work has been translated over. I hand the floor over and looking forward to hearing.
Thank you very much. Well, you will have noticed in the wonderful talks of both Kate and George a certain very personal and engaged style and expression of friendship. Well, that is exactly what they have been to me for many decades. And I'm delighted to see also Tali Loewenthal here, who also is a very deep friend and a colleague over the years. I think our I know I've engaged, involved, sought to involve George and Kate for ever since I think my whole this enterprise began in it began in 1996 before the Institute for Judaism and Civilization, when George was a partner in making a conference on Judaism and psychotherapy, and it could not have been done without him. And Kate has been the most gracious helper along the way as well. So thank you very, very much. Now,
What's her name?
Since both George and Kate have sort of introduced a personal note into their presentations and have related their own life and work to Frankl and to the issues at hand, I will also do that a little bit. And because it will actually also set out my agenda, if you like. And I hope that doesn't sound too sinister, but I hope it's a useful agenda, a good agenda. Now, going back all the way to 1996, which is, I don't know if George, I knew already quite well by then, so I don't know when we first met, but at all events, but this was before I had any awareness of the work of Viktor Frankl. And but what concerned me was the idea that religious people who also have psychological issues, quite independent of their religiosity, risked a certain vulnerability if they would, for example, themselves go to a therapist or send their children to a therapist if the need arose, whose attitudes were in a sense hostile to religion, who did not have the same beliefs, who did not grant credibility to the existence of God. They would not give credibility to the notion of a soul, conscience, and so on and so forth. So in those pre-Frankl days, for me, I was sort of an issue of major concern. How do we find therapy? How do we? What are the requirements of a therapy which respect the model of the human being, which is a religious model, a body, a mind, and a soul? So that was a major concern, and that was the subject of a first conference in 1996. As I said, I was not yet aware of the work of Viktor Frankl. Maybe I think my parents had a copy of Man's Search for Meaning in their house, and I sort of recall seeing it, but I don't think I'd read it. And at all events, it was a new territory. Now, I have a friend of mine in this community in Melbourne, Dr. Matt Gelman, told me, performed a double service. First of all, he told me that a great religious mentor, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, had actually wanted the work of Frankl to be promoted, that he was seen as a therapist whose work was valuable, whose work was authentic from the standpoint of faith. And then Dr. Gelman did something which was much more practical than that. He actually took me to meet the niece of Viktor Frankl, whose name was Liesl Kozma. She's a translator of one of the essays in the book, who was living in Melbourne. Frankl's sister, Stella, had come to live, as Kate pointed out, come to live in Australia, and they had a daughter, Liesl, I think she was by this stage also a widow herself. And we went to her house, and she pulled out a box of books of Frankl, books that were in German, and these included a number of small books with writings which are to this day relatively little known. Works, many of which were written in the 1940s, and this actually opened when I also opened one of these little books and read the essay called 10 Theses Concerning a Person, with that astonishing statement which George quoted, that the invention of the human being is the imitation of God. I like to use the secular vernacular, I was blown away, because we're not used to hearing great psychologists use expressions like the ultimate discovery of the human being is the image of God. That is not part of the vocabulary of psychology that we had grown up with, or that we are aware of. Anyway, so I began over the years to translate stage-wide works of Viktor Frankl, and to hold seminars on his work. Now, the importance of Viktor Frankl is initially, precisely, and particularly from a religious standpoint, is the fact that he credits a faculty called conscience. Actually, there's a more neutral term for this. It's called the noetic faculty, the faculty which is a meaning-seeking faculty. But in truth, this noetic faculty can be something quite unspiritual. It can be a faculty which has to do with worldviews. And worldviews are not all spiritual. They can quite simply be ideological sometimes. Human beings have meaning. But Frankl saw that this noetic faculty, this meaning-seeking faculty, has actually got a spiritual content, or at least a spiritual potential. And that this is unlocked by the process of self-transcendence. Self-transcendence means transcendence of the self. What self? The self which Frankl calls the psychophysical self, the lower self, the body, the self of body and mind. How can the person rise above the predicament, rise above the maelstrom, so to speak, of impulses and perceptions, whether these come from within or whether they are stress which impinges from without, as in the concentration camps or as in a host of traumatic circumstances. How does the person rise above this, above this turbulent psychophysical self, and take a stance, so to speak, elevate, levitate out of this situation, and ask, well, this is my predicament. What am I supposed to do with it? What is its meaning? How am I to respond? And this, in a nutshell, is the challenge to the person to say, not what do I want of life, with all of my surging feelings, impulses, perceptions, but rather, what does life want of me? Now, this concept of a transcending self, a self which distinguishes itself from the turbulent interests and drives and perceptions within the person, is a self which I would call an interestless self. In other words, in itself, it is simply ready to ask the question, what's wanted? And with that knowledge which somehow that self-transcending aspect, that higher self can access, it's then able to return to the predicament of the body and the mind and say, all right, now I will look at this and I will decide what to make of it all. I am not committed to, it's not shamed in any way whatsoever to impulse and perception, but rather it adjudicates between impulse and perception. It decides how the person needs to respond. It makes over emotion and perception. So, in contradistinction to Freud, whose work Frankl would have characterized as pan-deterministic, in other words, that the human being is determined by impulse, instinct, and perception. Frankl reverses that and says, yes, of course it's true. Our mental and emotional conditions are definitely things which we cannot ignore. They are major, they are co-conditioning. But ultimately, the human being is free and answerable to a higher meaning and purpose. And that this, in fact, this faculty of conscience is the sovereign faculty within the human being. Not the psychophysical self. It's the psychophysical self are mere vehicles, unruly vehicles, which the higher self needs to train. So there was another aspect also which intrigued me in Frankl's work. And let me prep before I come to that. Let me say the following. Frankl's work was a breath of fresh air to many, coming out of Freudianism and behavioral psychologies and so on, because it focused on meaning. However, we have to know that the very important thing is that meaning per se is not necessarily a source of succor, or is it necessarily a redemptive thing. The terrorist has meaning. The Nazi has meaning. Everybody has got meaning. And these meanings, if you like, are what form their worldviews, and sometimes they're pretty horrible worldviews as well. The question is, much rather, as how granted that meaning, the meaning faculty is the highest of all, how do we guarantee, so to speak, that this does not take us into a realm of moral relativism? In other words, that the meanings themselves are not something which are just rationales of feeling and emotion. They're not just ideologies which arise out of interests, whether these are psychological interests, emotive interests, and so on and so forth. And what struck me as very, very important in Frankl's work was the idea is that he was certainly, I have to say that there is a certain equivocation in Frankl's work. It's not all clear. There are elements of contradiction. I draw attention to this straight away at the beginning of the book, but I am latching on to one strand, which I think is a strong, dominant, persistent strand in Frankl's work. And in this strand, Viktor Frankl opposes moral relativism. And he is saying that there is actually a trajectory along which self-transcendence carries us to this extraordinary term, which is a theological term, imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. And Frankl says, and this also blew me away. Frankl says in one place that when we enter into this mode of self-transcendence, which is the suspension of personal interests, true self-transcendence, true self-transcendence, he says that when a secular person, a person who has regarded him or herself as an agnostic or even as an atheist, when such a person embarks upon this real self-transcendence, not what I want, but what does life want of me? Frankl says, I think this is in the essay Time and Responsibility, one of the translations, he says, that person is en route to the destination which the religious person has already reached. In other words, there is something called the soul. For the religious person, it's called conscience, because they're not really, soul is already a religious terminology, it relates to God and so on and so forth. But self-transcendence, pure self-transcendence lays bare a faculty in the human being, which every human being has. And in the atheist or the agnostic, so-called, it's who is willing to undergo self-transcendence. That terminus has not been reached. But there is something objective about there is an objective moral goal, so to speak, to which the self-transcending person tends. Now, this is for me of great significance because, first of all, even without this, Frankl has given us very important things. He's given us the concept that the human being is free. The human being is free because the human being is not determined. The human being is not driven. The human being, freedom derives from the fact that we can choose whether to follow the dictates of impulse or to follow conscience as something which has detached itself from impulse and perception, a counterweight. This is the word he uses, it's a counterweight to impulse and perception. That's what choice is. If conscience does not come into the place, into consideration, then so-called freedom is just a choice whether to be driven by this instinct or that instinct, whether chocolate ice cream or strawberry ice cream. That's not freedom, in my view. To be able to choose between chocolate and strawberry ice cream, it's not freedom. True freedom is the ability to choose between being driven and not being driven. And this is something which is of tremendous importance to contemporary thought, the contemporary situation in much psychology at the moment. But point number two is that Frankl says and certainly in the essays which I have drawn in this strand, this motif through Frankl's work, Frankl is saying not any meaning will do. I reject, he says, moral relativism. This is the Frankl. Sometimes Frankl seems to be going the other way. But Frankl does clearly state a number of points. These are the points which I personally latch on to, Frankl, that there is to be rejected moral relativism. In other words, the human being has a, if you like, a moral subconscious. We might call it the soul or something of that sort. And it is elicited through the process of self-transcendence. Now, why is this so important today? The importance of this today arises from the fact that we live in a world. Now, as I say, I'm not a psychologist. So what am I writing a book about Frankl for? Chutzpah, I don't know, but hopefully it's useful. If I have the approbation of George and Kate, then I haven't strayed too bad. But I know who I am and what I'm not. At all events, we live in a world today where there are strong psychological strands or therapies which say that the human being is indeed driven, which say that a person's impulse, a child's impulse, is defining in an enduring manner for its identity, that a child's perception at time T1 is determining for the child's identity through life. To the extent, I'm sorry, I don't want to be political, I can't help, but we have now, unfortunately, we have legislation in place which says that a parent may not interfere in any way with the self-perception of a child. I don't know what age, 9, 10, 11, 12, or even younger, because this is determining. The person is determined by impulse and perception at a certain stage. Well, that is not what that is not what Frankl. That's not Frankl's message. Frankl's message is that the human being is a person, is engaged in constant choice and constant struggle between a psychophysical self and a moral self, a reflective self, a self of conscience. And the importance, therefore, of Frankl's work is of terrible urgency today. Because in Australia today, I have to tell you, I didn't come here to make trouble that upset people. But there is in Victoria today a therapist who is engaged by an adult who says, I am not happy with certain impulses and perceptions which I have of myself because they clash with my conscience. And I want help with this. I want to help to remake my inner self. I want this, it's voluntary. The therapist who offers that assistance could face a jail sentence. It's an incredible situation. It's led to an invasion of the schools, telling religious schools what they can teach and what they cannot teach. In other words, it is a formal negation of the concept of conscience and the freedom to bring conscience to bear on the psychophysical self altogether. Now, I won't develop that much more, but here particularly, the irony is that this is that some people say Frankl's work is authoritarian because he talks about absolute values. Well, I don't know of anything more authoritarian than the contemporary psychological theories which say that a child knows what it is, and the child is to be taken out of the parent's care, and puberty blockers and so on and so forth to be applied to the child because the child is defined by an impulse and a perception at age 9, 10, 11, or something of that sort. And a parent or a therapist or a school which opposes this, which says we have a tradition about what conscience is and how the human beings to make themselves over, so to speak, that is criminalized with jail sentences and with fines. So I won't, sorry, I hope I haven't upset anyone, but nowhere, in other words, so what we have here is essentially two things. We have number one. Frankl tells us the human being is free, and the freedom derives from the natural conflict and struggle between conscience and impulse and perception. That is what freedom is all. That is what human freedom is all about. Secondly, Frankl seems to be selling us, and I believe this is a message which comes from Frankl, is that in all of these competing therapies and models of the human being which tell us what the human being is, Frankl is actually taking a stand in this struggle of ideas. He is taking a stand in what the human being actually is, because we are faced now with a tremendous, with a horrendous choice. On the one hand, there is an ascendant doctrine which says, you know, I'll tell you what the human being is. The human being is a bunch of impulses and perceptions, and anybody who stands in the way of their realization is to be criminalized. That's one view. And the other view is a view such as that of Frankl, which is it is not true. The human being is as much conscience as the other, and it is part of the nature of the human being to engage in struggle, to engage in inner conflict, and to ultimately to answer to conscience. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm sorry as if I'm you know, whatever it is, too much grandstanding here, but all events. And just as I started off with a deep interest in Frankl, because Frankl indeed was answering to the question of how can a religious person find a therapist, and then his wholly appropriate concern for the idea of human freedom, the sovereignty of conscience within the individual, and thirdly, and this is a theme which I do tend to try to develop in this work, is to say that, you know what, conscience has a content. There is a science of the soul. It doesn't mean that we disregard others. To the contrary, it leads us to respect and love for others, because every human being has this latent image of God within. But it's very important now, at this time, to ask the question, what is the human being? And if we throw this tweet, and certainly the other side has not given us the option of moral relativism. It's insisted on its own stance, and it criminalizes any other stance. But at all events, we are now in a situation where we must know what is the human being. And this is not just a question of the structure of human personality and the elements within it, but we have to know what is normative and what we may appeal to as normative within that conscience itself. So thank you all very much for attending. I'm deeply grateful to both Kate and George for their care, for their generosity of time and involvement, which it's not the first time I've experienced it. Thank you to Douglas and to the Viktor Frankl Institute of Australia for hosting. And now I hand it back to you, Douglas, in case there are any questions.
Douglas. Thank you, Rabbi Shimon Cowen. I will now open the floor up for question and answers, if we have any, and I will go through the process of unmuting everyone, so you're in a position to do so.
I've left everybody speechless.
Rabbi Cowen,
Yes.
firstly, apologies for coming late. I took a lot longer where I was before to come in, but I got to hear enough. I like the points you're making about the way the institutions reward impulses rather than, when it comes to identity and things. And that's not political, it's just what's happening. I've got a friend who's a very devout Catholic who absolutely is fed up with what you were talking about. And she's deeply concerned about what you said about, going for the impulses and having acceptance of the changing of identity and the what's offered for young children. At what point, again, the question becomes, does that become abuse?
Well, I think that we won't let a child drive a car at the age of 9, and we will not let a child vote at the age of 9. But it seems that unfortunately the state government of Victoria has something called mature minor status, that they can take the child out of the jurisdiction of its parents when the child is clearly a minor. Now, I'm sorry to say, I feel that is abuse. I mean, George, I'm sure George and Kate have got much more to say about this. And I know George has spoken very courageously, because many cases we have trauma. And it is and this methodology simply affirms a symptom without getting to the causes. It's not fair to the child. It's not fair to the adult. And it's simply, what it does is it eliminates human autonomy. It eliminates the whole concept of maturation. After all, what is education? This is a very important concept. The human being is actually, unfortunately, capable of anything. A human being, a child, can be molded in any way whatsoever, it seems. Now, that's why we have something called an education, so that we do not become thieves, we do not become violent, we don't become murderers. This whole concept of education is precisely the concept of the installation of conscience. So it seems to me that it's tragic when a child is denied that process of education, of parental care, parental involvement, love. And it's also tragic for an adult, that an adult should be denied the right to live in accordance with his or her own conscience, just because there are contrary impulses raging in his own or her own breast. Why can't a human being? It's a fundamental freedom to be able to live the way one wants to live. And when this therapeutic assistance is removed, you are in fact condemning people to turmoil in many cases. Now, I don't have the clinical experience. I'm sure George could say much more about this than I. In fact, I'd like, if George doesn't mind, if he's willing to and happy to, I'd like to hear his comments on this question.
Thank you. I think that this is probably one of the most controversial areas of child and infant, adolescent psychiatry and medicine in the last 30 years or so. So I would make very cautious comments here, because it is not only a medical issue, but a social and cultural trend. Now, keeping it very strictly within my professional competence and boundary, it has always been, and that's been documented for many decades, at least 100 years, that children have identities that are not always male or female according to boy or girl birth gender or sexual birth. What has happened in the last 15 years or so, the numbers have grown out of proportion, and there are many debates and explanations as to the cause. It doesn't remove the basic issue that there's always been a group who have been what are called transgender. Now, I don't want to advocate one side or the other, merely to present some medical facts. But such a child, if they are not treated, and they are genuinely from the age of 2 or 3 or 4, behaving and believing that they are in the wrong body, then to deny them treatment is malpractice. On the other hand, there is an enormous amount of upsurge, especially in rapid onset adolescent girls, especially in the last 5 or 10 years, that do not belong to this historical group. If these people do not get proper assessment, that also potentially is malpractice. And indeed, it has gone to a High Court ruling from the Tavistock in London as a High Court ruling in December 2020. And the appeal court upheld that and made provisions to reinterpret that finding in 2021. So as Shimon says, he cited cases in Victorian law. There's also international law. And this is the reason why I don't want to go into the debate, but just present some facts. And this is far from a resolved conversation. And before you came onto the Zoom, I mentioned a disclaimer that I do not practice any practice informed by Frankl, for the reason that I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist with mother-infant issues, where logotherapy and conscience of a child do not feature as the primary mode of my work. However, I take Shimon's point very strongly that we do have a conscience, and the medical profession has a conscience too. We also have things called medico-legal laws, specifically to attend where there is a transgression of practice. Another word we have is iatrogenesis, that is diseases that are caused by doctors. And many of us are talking about iatrogenic contribution to this debate, which then comes back, and that I can talk about, because then I can interrogate my conscience and say, how am I coping with my conscience if I do not assess a child properly? That's not the child's responsibility. As Shimon said, 9-year-olds don't get to vote, they don't get to drive, they don't have license to drink and so on. Yet they apparently have the right, but I say apparently. That is now in front of the courts in many jurisdictions in the UK, in the US and elsewhere. And as we speak, the clinical guidelines are now being altered in a number of European countries in the shadow or the aftermath of the UK High Court ruling with the Tavistock case, the Bell and Tavistock case.
Thank you, George. So,
Can I?
I think Holly would like to say something.
Yes.
I think this has been a fascinating and beautiful session, and I thank all the speakers very much, including George just now. But my comment or question is going to pull back to Frankl himself and away from the current discussion. So if Batya or Kate are continuing the current discussion, maybe you speak first, and then I will try to ask something relating not to the current confusion about gender and transgender, but back to Frankl and philosophy. So maybe Batya and Kate should come before me.
Well, I wanted to say something that wasn't related to this. So if you want to speak first, it's okay.
And I simply wanted to ask if you were willing to make a contribution to the topic that was just being discussed, but you've clearly said that you want to get back to I should say that Sally has enormous experience in consulting with in the educational system on the issues relating to gender identity and the religious rulings in the schools. But apparently you don't wish to say anything further.
Well, the problem is we're there at a nexus of legal thinking or legal adjudications, medical practice in terms of physical, medical, surgical operations, issues to do with people's consciousness, and then religion, and the concept of values, whether there are values any kind of absolute values, absolute truths. It's a phenomenally complex maelstrom. I think that within the education system where I do work, to a certain extent in my activities, it's a matter of finding a little niche where one is able to present the positive kind of thinking that you have all three presented today as represented by Frankl. Now, not in my university teaching, but in my school teaching, Frankl does figure because I use I have a glimmer of a perspective of Frankl, and especially the way that Shimon was speaking today, which I've made notes on. You see, my prime field is Chabad Hasidic philosophy. So that's part of the Jewish Hasidic movement, and Chabad presents a kind of a theoretical theology or philosophy of life, which in its prime text is particularly focused on the Jewish community. What I see in Frankl is a possibility of a universalization of just those concepts. And Shimon's discussion of the conscience, which is developed through an individual achieving self-transcendence, which nurtures the conscience, that I think is a vital universalization of what Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi called the divine soul. And I wanted to ask Shimon what he thought of that approach in analyzing what you yourself have said this evening.
Well, I certainly do believe this. After all, Frankl himself gave the indication that this, he was, when he said in that extraordinary one sentence which got me going in Frankl's work, the discovery of the human being is the imitation of God. Now that is a clear theological, ethical statement about the structure of the soul. The soul is, what does it mean to imitate the divine? It means it's an ethical code. And this is something which I believe is fundamental now. But I will mention also that you mentioned the Jewish aspect of this. So I wanted to actually in this book bring out that this is something which is actually for all humanity, because there is something that the notion of the divine likeness, which in Hebrew we call Tselem Elokim. This is a universal possession, and it actually, I mean, I'll just to give you a taste, a savoring. I mean, in a little bit of mysticism, where we speak about 7 divine attributes. Now, there happen to be 7 universal Noahide laws, and there is a direct connection between these two. In other words, the imitation of God, of these divine attributes, translates into modalities of conduct. Now, the funny thing is that Freud himself was on this. Freud, the great anti-religious thing. What do you think Eros is? What is Eros? Eros for Freud is the instinctual complex which relates to sexuality. Now, in religious terms, they call it Eros, means love in Greek, as far as I know. Well, it's the name of a Greek deity which symbolized the idea of love. Now, in spiritual terms, there is also a divine attribute, which in Hebrew is called chesed. And this is also about love. So the question we have to say is, and love, of course, love is definitely related to sexuality. The question is, what is the proper gestalt? What is the proper form of human sexuality? What is this chesed, which Freud called eros, not knowing what it is? What, in other words, so the answer is that this attribute can have a, if you like, a holy manifestation, and it can have an unholy manifestation. I think that Freud's disinhibited eros is the unholy manifestation of this attribute, of this complex within the human person. So, a lot of the book, which is drawing heavily on the Maharal of Prague, whom Frankl actually described as a forerunner of his dimensional ontology of human personality. This great thinker, actually forms a tallies the departments of psyche with these laws. In other words, just like, and not only that, it gives us a clue to the way in which the Freudian impulses, whether it's eros or thanatos or narcissism, these actually are degenerate or raw or primary, untamed forms of what could potentially be divine structures of relating to these various instinctual departments within the human being, the attributes, or in Hebrew called the midot, the measures. So, yes, if I believe that Frankl is showing us. There's a lot of extrapolation here because, I mean, this be true. Frankl did not know a great deal about mysticism, but he knew about the Maharal, and he claims the Maharal was his predecessor, forerunner in this. But I believe that what we can do is that we can import and into Frankl's work and develop Frankl's work in a way which harmonizes very much with this theological dimension. And if you look at one of the essays in the book, The Science of the Soul, Frankl says that the psychological dimension is included within theological dimension because the human being has a spiritual dimension. And just as the human being has a spiritual dimension, so it is also that psychology needs to understand, is included in a sense within this higher spiritual or theological dimension. And it is ultimately informant. You may ask me, what's this got to do with practical therapy, with trauma treatment, with child psychiatry? That's all good. There is definitely, all of this is important, empirical, psychological science. However, Frankl said that logotherapy is a supplement, is a spiritual supplement. It is something which rides in tandem with specific therapies. But we need to have it at all times because we need to know what the higher dimension of the human being is. In other words, what are the parameters within which treatment proceeds? To what goal do we want to heal the human being? What is that goal of the healed human being? What is that whole human being? At all events, so the short answer is yes. Yes, go. Yeah. Further comments? Sorry.
If I could just. Oh. Okay, go ahead, Batya.
Okay, thank you. I want to make a personal appeal. I am the head of the Viktor Frankl Institute in Israel. Our colleagues, myself and my colleagues, we've been talking about these topics for a very long time. And my mentor, Dr. Tria Chantal, who studied personally from Frankl, she came to Judaism through logotherapy. And, and so I really would like to be more connected. I'd like to carry on this conversation with all of you. And I've been writing about this and I've been teaching about this. I teach students from all over the world in my online courses. And, I want to just say in that regard to George also that I've had a few students who have worked with children using logotherapy, because you mentioned logos is deeper than logic. And so they frame it in a way that children can understand. And they'll say, one of them had two puppets, Clevey and Stoopy. Stoopy is the stupid advice. So when you are afraid of something, who's speaking? Is it Stoopy telling you to be afraid of that, or is it Clevie, the clever one, who's telling you? You know, so I can tell you about her project as well. And one of my students from Greece, Eleni, is here today in this meeting. And so yeah, that's basically what I want to say.
Very, very interesting. I'd just like to go back to a point which I think is very, very relevant here, which hasn't actually been mentioned by you, Shimon, in terms of this process that's taking place in society. It very much has to do with the nature of the human. Now, Paul wrote in the chat, you know, is this about personal faith? That's outside what Frankl writes in the book. Now, that might be. But what Frankl does write is about what being human is. And I think what we're facing is a tremendous challenge to the concept of the human being. Because since Darwin, there's a tendency to see human beings just running in a straight line from animals. And if an animal can live according to its impulse, so can a human being. And so there's nothing to say that I shouldn't, if I have an impulse to do this or to do that, as long as it's within some kind of principle of the greatest good for the greatest number or something like that, and it doesn't obviously harm other people, so I should be allowed to do it or get some hormones or medical attention in order to help me do it. But if we say the human being has a distinctive quality, as indeed Frankl does seem to be saying, then the situation is different. And I think that by being able to inject this element into the consciousness of society is a vitally important piece of work. And I see the maelstrom of, whether the law is this way or that way, whether they permit therapists to do or forbid therapists to do, or what they force teachers to do or don't. We have a fascinating situation in England. A science teacher is not allowed to say that Darwinism is a theory. He has to present, or she has to present it as fact. Absolutely ridiculous. But the religious studies teacher, which is the role I have in the school where I teach, we can say it's a theory and there's a lot of evidence against it. And I'd just like to end with a little piece of evidence against it. In 2014, an interesting article was published by a number of students, scholars of language. The most famous one is Noam Chomsky and a group of his colleagues. Now, I don't agree with a lot of what Chomsky says about politics, but I am fascinated by what he says about language. The article was in order to express the disappointment that he and his colleagues felt at not having been able to make an evolutionary track leading from animals to man on the question of language. And it records the findings of several experts in the field of language that they had been unable to show an evolutionary track leading from the most high sophisticated animals to man and woman. And so there is the gap. And I think that that gap is what Frankl is underlining: conscience, and a higher conscience, which comes about through self-transcendence. And I think that that's a very important thing, and that really introduces a whole new perspective on life, which it is to be hoped that organizations like this and your work and Batya's work and others will become another color in the maelstrom of legal and social thinking, and hopefully will lead to a new atmosphere in the world.
Thank you. Well, Douglas, do you think we've exhausted everybody sufficiently?
Someone's got their hand up.
Very close. I've noticed Hidayat has had a
Yes.
question some time ago.
Yeah, I had it. Yes, I think it's maybe I'll raise that question because I'm writing a thesis. I'm writing a diplomate thesis on logotherapy, and the topic is logotherapy with storytelling and poetry. And I read lots of Hasidic stories. I mean, they are amazing. And Martin Buber's books, I read them, and I'd like to ask a question to Kate or Shimon or George, where can I find, because, those stories are there, but, how about the explanation? How can we find an explanation for that story? Because the story is told, but where can it be used? Because, I also read, probably Batya knows that David Gutman, his stories, logotherapy via Hasidic stories, it's amazing as well. He tells in a more therapeutic way. So where can I find a book, which explains those type of things? And also the second one is I'm really interested in post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder and transgenerational trauma as well. And how Jewish people dealt with it. Because, the reason why I'm asking is, I'm from Turkey and I have a background of Alevi Bektashi. We are sort of minority from Turkey and we are 10% of Turkish population. And, we've been traumatized for centuries as well. And that's why, I'd like to learn, how you cope with that trauma, especially the Holocaust and the beforehand as well, because there is a big continuity of the history of trauma of the Jewish people. How do you cope with those type of things? Because, I think it comes to the human being. I think what's human, Shimon said, what's human? Because, we've been traumatized, when we look at from the history. There are so many wars, so many atrocities happened, so many massacres happened. And in a way, the societies learned how to cope with it, and that's why we have to learn that wisdom to share with other human communities as well. Thank you.
Maybe the best thing we could do is to give you email addresses and we'll answer your question. You've asked a lot of questions.
Okay, I'll write my email to the chat. Okay.
I'll be happy to redirect. I'll be happy to direct you to.
Yes.
I have everybody's email address here.
All right. I mean, I'll write it again.
Send it off if you like. So you send me an email and I will send you to George for one question, to Kate for another question, and no one else if that's unless other people would like it.
All right. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, very important questions, both of them. And I was wondering whether Tully would be able to answer the first question. I'm sure you're armed to answer it, Tully.
Well, what exactly did you mean by the explanation of the stories?
In fact, what I'm saying is, like David Gutman says that, in logotherapy session, you use those stories. So in a way, I'd like an explanation, where can it be used? Like, there is because some of them I understand, I can relate straight away, but some of them, it doesn't make sense. So if there is because, I think I can understand that, in a meeting, spiritual meeting with the Hasidic people, it's all about the storytelling. The whole philosophy is conveyed via storytelling. And then, then if something arises, then the rabbi says, okay, for that case, I have such and such story, I tell you that story. Yeah.
There is actually a theoretical dimension to Hasidism, and that is expressed in the book Tanya by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, which has been translated into English.
Okay.
And I would recommend a study of that. There are many explanatory works explaining it as well. There's one called Lessons in Tanya, which is in 5 volumes, which is, it used to be a radio presentation in Yiddish on a New York radio station. And that text was then transcribed and translated. And that's quite a good way of accessing its ideas.
Yeah.
Douglas, if I may say so, I don't want to strain the bonds of friendship here by keeping George and Kate and all of these good people much longer. But
let us
maybe we
make
should
some
wrap it up.
concluding remarks, and we'll follow up anything with personal emails. Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Well,
so I'd like to finish by just saying, as a fellow member of the Viktor Frankl Institute of Australia, I'd like to thank Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cowen for his continued work in exploring in detail and illuminating deeply important work of Dr. Viktor Frankl. The work of Frankl has produced tremendous benefits in the field of psychology, philosophy, and the human sciences, whilst offering a system where self-transcendence, the existential considerations, and the divine can be explored and engaged through the noetic and unitive realms of human constitution. Dr. Rabbi Shimon Cowen's work is an important contribution to understanding Viktor Frankl's journey as a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and a man of religious faith, as he develops his approach to therapy through logotherapy. Dr. Rabbi Shimon Cowen's book, The Rediscovery of the Human, Psychological Writings of Viktor Frankl on the Human in the Image of the Divine, is available in paperback. It's published by Hybrid Publishers and is currently retailing for $24.99 in Australia. It's also available in ebooks, and it can be found on any major online store at this point. So I'd like to say thank you personally for being able to have the opportunity to host this. And if you have any concluding remarks, Dr. Rabbi Shimon Cowen, I'll hand it over to you.
All I want to say is thank you to you, Douglas, and thank you to everybody. Lovely to see friends and to make new friends, and wish everybody very well. May we help the rediscovery of the human into a public manifestation and phenomenon. It's to humanize society. Please God. All the best. Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.